the thing that makes me most furious on the internet, I'm not exactly sure why, is people quote tweeting someone that they're frustrated with and saying, "We're cooked." And I'm like, well, fuck. You know, we're not cooked.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Bulwark. I am Sam Stein, managing editor for the site. I am joined by Senator Brian Schatz, a real special guest today. Before we get into it, please do subscribe to the feed. It really helps us when you click that button. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're a busy guy. I know there's a lot going on. I just kind of want to start with the broad scope of things. It's been 6 weeks since the election. Have we exhausted the postmortem period? Are you still in it? And have you learned anything new or made any more discoveries about the state of the Democratic Party in the past couple of weeks that you didn't have from right after the election?
A couple of thoughts. First, thanks for having me. Thanks for everything you do on the site. Thanks to your entire team. I read it regularly. Look, I think that we're certainly not done analyzing what went wrong, and we are very far from done developing a strategy for what to do next. But I'll offer just a couple of thoughts. And I think you may have heard me say that I am suspicious of people who have comprehensive, clean takes about what just happened, because like any election, a lot of things happened all at the same time. There's a person from Hawaii who used to say everything's worth 2%. If your name's easy to pronounce, that's 2%. If you're tall, that's 2%. If you're mean to people, that's 2% in the wrong direction. And I think the number is not 2%, but the point is everything matters.
Right.
And so that does not lend itself to a sort of clean explanation of why we lost. But let me offer a couple of thoughts. I do think that Democrats got a little bit carried away with what I'm calling bank shots. Like, we are describing things that are important, but we are describing things that are important in ways that are unrelatable.
What's
some
an
of it is
example
just
of
like
that?
a linguistic issue, but some of it is actually that we have decided to become the defenders of norms, institutions, rules, prerogatives, agencies, programs, line items, and nobody knows what the hell any of that is. And so we have to fight for people. We have to defend people. And that's not just like a rhetorical change, but that is an attitudinal shift to say, hey, if the bureaucracy is not working, that is not actually our problem, that it may be our problem to fix, but that is not our problem to own. We do not have to be Soviet in our style. We can be frustrated with the way things are going.
Well, let
we
me
don't
hold
have
on.
to say
Hold
everything
on.
is fine.
Let me push you back on that for a second. I know you have, there's a lot more points you want to get to, because I was talking with your colleague, Senator Murphy, about this. And I think one of the issues that happens here, and I just don't know how you get out of it, right, is that if Trump comes out and he says, you know what, I'm going to deny the results of an election, then instinctually Democrats want to defend the institution of democracy. If Trump comes out like he did last night and sues the Des Moines Register and settles a defamation suit with ABC News, then the instinctual thing for Democrats is to say, actually, no, we need to defend the media and the role that they play in governance. And so aren't you sort of forced into this role of institutional defender by virtue of the fact that Trump has taken a blowtorch to the institutions? And how do you get away from that pattern?
Well, first of all, I do think it matters whether or not we are at an 11 every morning.
Right.
And I don't think we should be. And I think there are going to be exceptions to that rule, right? Like I say we're not the defenders of programs, but like some programs are recognizable and they are a proxy for what they do for people, as in Social Security, right?
Right.
I don't have to explain the Social Security program, and I'm not going to take myself so literally that I'm not going to say Social Security anymore. I'm going to say money that comes in that you pay, whatever, right? And I think likewise with the First Amendment itself, right? Anybody who's like a voter is going to at least understand probably the First and the Second Amendment of the Constitution. It's okay to talk about that. Yeah. And I also think there's a threshold beyond which we should be screaming bloody murder about what's happening, right? Like we saw what happened in Seoul over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And this is advice about how we do daily messaging. But if the incoming president, for instance, declares martial law, for no damn reason. It starts to try to jail members of the media. Like maybe we can figure out exactly how to say it, but that would be a hair
on fire moment. Yeah, okay.
But you're right that tactically it presents this incredible challenge because, by the way, every single day there is an outrage. And so, but that's the trick, right? That is the Trump trick, which is his ability to flood the zone and make it sort of confusing and tactically difficult to respond without sounding like you're like ranting and raving on a street corner.
Were you surprised, I suppose, that the outrage didn't move more people? By that, I mean, just look specifically at January 6th, right? Like, it seems to me a very sober understanding and calculation would be that, in fact, that's disqualifying. Like, what he did is totally disqualifying. And of course, the American public would agree that inciting a riot to overturn an election so that you can remain in power disqualifies you from office. And yet here we are. Like, why do you think certain hair on fire moments did not translate more with the voting public?
I don't know the answer to that, except that I think that this election became not about that, right? It became about other things. And sometimes, candidates want the election to be about the thing that is advantageous to them, and voters get to decide what an election is about. And so there were a number of people, I think, who said, look, I'm pissed about the Dobbs decision, but I'm going to vote for reproductive choice in my own state, right? Or reproductive choice is already enshrined in statute in my own state, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, right? And so if I knew that the question of presidential choice determined what happened with reproductive rights, maybe I'd vote differently, but I have enough room here to say, yeah, I think this guy's a bit of a jackass, but I really don't like Joe Biden. Yeah. And I don't like, I don't know enough about Kamala Harris. And so I'm going to give this guy a run. I mean, I was talking to an old buddy of mine from home who said he thinks a lot of people just said, okay, dude, we're going to give you a short leash and we'll see how this thing goes. And there was a fair amount of that. I also think that, and I don't want to get into, blaming us for everything that has gone wrong, but I do think we have to do some soul searching about right or wrong, fair or unfair, why we just got our asses kicked. And I know people.
Did you get your asses kicked? Let's stop for a second there, because this is actually a debate in the party. Like some people, some people are like, yes, it was obviously a very bad defeat. And yet, like, what is it? 5-vote majority in the House, the Senate contest minus Bob Casey were totally expected. 200,000 votes in 3 states. Is it an ass whooping?
But I don't know. I mean, I'm in the Senate because of 1,782 votes, right? Maggie Hassan is in the Senate because of, I think, around 1,000 votes. Nobody remembers the Portland Trailblazers, right? Who I think took the Bulls to 7, if I'm not mistaken. And so losing is losing. Maybe someone wants to quibble and say, well, we didn't
talking about the Clyde Drexler Trailblazers? I'm not sure they went to 7, but I get your point.
Well, we're going to have to.
We'll fact check that one, yeah.
But I mean, I don't know if we got our asses kicked, but if they certainly won the trifecta.
They did do that, yeah.
It was certainly a bad result. But let me take you through what I think happened for at least some people. When COVID came along, the government, institutions, corporations, politicians told everybody they were going to die. Now, and that was a real risk, and many people did die. So I'm not trying to crap all over, I thought, what was a pretty robust COVID response. We supported people's income. We got the vaccines deployed. We came through a pandemic. More lives could have been saved. Also mistakes were made. But we told people, hey, listen, you're going to die. Then definitionally, the people who didn't die are still around, right? And then we say democracy is going to die, right? And then democracy doesn't die. And then we say 4 years later, by the way, this time is the time to be worried about American-style democracy collapsing.
Right.
And I just think people just stopped believing this idea that we're always at the precipice of a catastrophe. They don't like living like that. They are willing to reject information that indicates that it is that serious. And one of the things that I'm learning as you study other movements that have fought autocracy is usually the best way to fight autocracy is to not necessarily talk about autocracy, right? Is you find out that people's individual pain points, which usually have to do with corruption and their own economic circumstances and their desire for freedom, and elevate that. But building a movement called "I can't believe he did that" is a good way to get to around 46%.
That was the lesson that the opposition to Berlusconi took, which is that everyone from the outside was like, "Oh, look at this buffoon! Like he's totally out of touch, and like how could voters ever vote for this guy?" And yet, what took him down was exposing corruption and economics. I would actually add that the hair on fire stuff you talked about, like the COVID specifically, it's not that people stop believing the apocalyptical predictions of your members of your party. It's that they actively sought out people who were going to do the exact opposite. And I think you can draw a line between that and RFK's nomination right now. I mean, like the reason RFK and other health nominees are being put up is precisely because they say the experts are, misleading you. They're wrong. They're institutionalists and they are corrupted by their proximity to corporations. And so now we find ourselves in a really, the backlash is quite remarkable. Which brings me to RFK. Look, you're in the Senate. Obviously, you have a number of interesting nominations to consider. We'll use the word interesting. To me, this one stands out as different. Just because of what he represents. But I'm kind of curious as you look at the lay of these nominees, like what you make of Trump's decision to go with this slate and which ones you actually think are the most problematic.
Well, first of all, my official position until these people get submitted to the Senate is that I'm not going to, individually opine on each one, because part of it is like I really do think enough Republicans are going to make it so that some of these folks don't get to the starting line. And I'm not really sure which ones.
You actually think that, well, we saw that with Gates, right? So it's possible.
Gates and the DEA guy. And I think there are a few others that are still very much in flux.
Okay.
Don't bet on the unending courage of 5 Republicans to stand up to Trump. But I think the Gates thing was interesting to me because, he withdrew. Trump didn't seem too pissed. And onward. And so the question is whether Senate Republicans are going to kind of save Trump from his own excesses and give Trump enough deniability to be able to go back to Mar-a-Lago and say, like, dude, I tried.
Right.
And so I think that's a very real possibility. I will say this about RFK Jr. I am the son of a doctor, Dr. Erwin Schatz, may his memory be a blessing, was the first and only for a while person on the record to oppose the Tuskegee experiment on African-American men by the United States Public Health Service. And so my obligation to him, not having achieved a medical degree.
I was going to say, you probably were a huge disappointment that you didn't go into medicine.
I mean, this one is not going to be a hard one for me. I also think that it is one thing to part of, I think what's happened is, politics feels a lot more like a sporting event now where you're just kind of rooting for your guys.
Yeah.
And it's like fantasy football and you go like, Justin Tucker missed a field goal. Screw those people, whatever. But like when you're talking about a rise in diseases and a comeback of rubella, or polio, or measles, or mumps. And there are immunocompromised people in red and blue towns who are going to be like, what the fuck? Right. And so I think, the ones that I think present the biggest vulnerability for the Trump administration are the ones that are most likely to cause immediate harm in a way that is understandable and causes people to go like, hey, I wanted a disruptor, but like not in my kids' elementary school.
Right. I love the idea. So this idea of politics as a sport, it's fascinating to me too, because I think so much of what's happening now can be explained by Trump and his team's desire to just basically piss off people who are like you, Democrats and liberals. And, what they want to do is get a rise. And so, you see that like everywhere, right? The decision to invite Daniel Perry, the subway guy who chokeholded a disruptive homeless passenger on the subway to death, like they invited him to the football game, Army Navy football game, because I think they wanted to get a rise out of folks. Gets back to your point of not taking the bait and having your hair on fire so much. But I guess, how do you sort of maneuver through that playing field? Because I was also watching or reading an interview, Rob Flaherty, the digital guru for the CARES campaign, was talking about how so much of politics is now basically done through sports culture. It's like it's all gamesmanship. And, do people... Can you are there different tactical ways that you feel like Democrats have to approach politics and the media ecosystem because of that?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of thoughts. First, I do think we just need to speak more simply. Right. And this whole sort of Latinx thing was actually a distraction because no one was
saying that. Yeah, I was going to say that.
But it ended up being the shield that liberals could use and say, nobody's saying that. It's like, okay, but are you saying center the needs of the middle class, like center as a verb? Are you saying make space for? Are you saying things that nobody's ever heard of, right? It's not so much this particular question of identitarian stuff, but your whole vernacular sounds like just not a normal dude, and that's a problem. And so, and then you sort of layer on top of it the kind of staffy, groupsy, university style language on top of Senate or senator language, which is in the first place, real extra officious. And you got to take three minutes to clear your throat. And people look at us and go I don't know what the fuck he's saying, but I find him irritating. And so I think that's one thing. And I don't want to just dismiss it as some superficial question, because think of it like you're entering someone's home, right?
Right.
And if you just start talking in ways that are almost intentionally designed to be hard to understand, then people might think not just that you're from a different perspective, but kind of rude.
Yeah, but it's not just language though. You gotta because it's also mediums, right? There's no. I mean, we've talked about.
Well, Sam, that's what I was going to get to next. Okay. So then there's this question of the media ecosystem, right?
Right.
And we're just nowhere in certain communities, nowhere at all.
Right.
And, can some of that be solved by individual charismatic leaders? I think that's certainly the case. Just as an example, Democrats were basically losing TikTok, objectively speaking. And then when Kamala was the nominee, we won TikTok, right? Because you have a charismatic leader, you have someone who's kind of internet ready, and the platform is kind of, at least some of these platforms are sort of ideologically neutral. They just like viral shit. Right. And Kamala was interesting. And so there we go. We're off to the races. Right. But some of this is infrastructure, right? Some of this is about newspapers shutting down and MSNBC not viewing its job as being a sort of propaganda arm for the left, but rather they spend half their time crapping on the left. If you have one sort of media ecosystem that spends half their time crapping on the left, and then the other half of the media ecosystem that spends all of their time crapping on the left, that is a structural problem.
It's a lot of crap.
Not everything, but it's not nothing.
Well, the solutions are not easy, right? Find some billionaire to build some ecosystem. Doesn't actually work that way, right? You can't just manufacture an audience, right? They tried it. Air America did not succeed. Now maybe things are different because we've got a new online ecosystem, but Elon bought Twitter. He didn't build a new Twitter for a reason.
Yeah, I guess I think that I do not imagine that there's a magic wand or a $900 million check that will solve this problem.
Sure.
But I do think resources are required. And one of the resources that is required is the resource of our attention as elected officials, right? We're going and doing Maddow and Jake Tapper and God bless them, but that's not everybody, right?
That's why we're here. The Bulwark. That's everybody.
I'm not kidding like that. I do think podcasts are where I'm consuming a lot of my information.
Oh, no doubt. YouTube podcasts, it is where everyone is getting their information these days. Definitely a gravitational pull towards that. But again, though, it's you're part of a very select few members who have comfort in going on these things. And I think Additionally, there's very few members who have comfort going on conservative media. And that, I think, probably is where you guys have to make more inroads, right?
Yeah, I think we need to be everywhere. I think we need to be in conservative media. I think we need to bolster like explicitly left media to give them more credibility and a growing audience and a sense that there's momentum there. And then we need to go into media that is currently sort of viewed as, center right, but really they're just kind of entertainers, right?
Right.
And so part of, I think, what needs to happen is that we just all need to summon those instincts that got us to Congress, right? Got us to the United States Senate, which is I do feel, knock on wood, that I can go anywhere in the state of Hawaii and answer any question.
Right.
And the idea that I'm going to go onto a podcast and it's going to be like, hey, don't do that.
Right.
It's just a
Well,
little.
it's like if you entered the field, then this is the field, right? Like your job is to persuade people to your cause.
Yeah, and like so much of what happens when you do something like that is they go like, I kind of like him, right?
Right.
And I think one of the things that Trump did.
Well, maybe not always with you, but yeah, more or less.
No, I mean, this happens to politicians, not to me. I benefit from distance. But I do think one of the things that Trump did, and I believe it was his team, is they truly believed that they're getting blown out so badly in certain constituencies that any improvement would be a massive win, right?
Right.
Black voters, young voters, men, right?
Sure.
Latino voters, sometimes Asian voters as well. That they didn't need to win them all. They just needed to lose less badly. And so the thing that I take some, not comfort, but that I am hopeful about is that I think we just realized that coalitions are not fixed. It's not like this one-way ratchet where everyone moves in a conservative direction.
Right.
It's also the case that some of these people just might have said, you know what? There was a bunch of money in my pocket during COVID, frankly, because of Democrats, right? And the child tax credit. Like I think about my brother and sister-in-law who were entrepreneurs, and between the CTC and the $1,500 checks, were able to get out of culinary school debt and begin to start a business, right?
Yeah.
And what an incredible thing we were able to provide for people. But then the CTC vanishes and everything costs more.
Yeah.
And sure, the macroeconomic indicators are like, show that like we're doing better. If you get whatever, all these fancy pants progressive economists on TV, they'll say, we have performed better than other industrial.
Than every other industrial nation, right? Yeah.
So, by the way, it's 100% true, right? And if I'm trying to buy eggs, I'm like, fuck off. What does that even mean?
Well, the other thing, so Ron Clay made this point, and I think there's some validity to it, and it seems like you're adopting it, which is that when the child tax credit vanished, Democrats actually got blamed for it because they had provided a benefit, they were in power, and then the benefit went away. Even though, minus Joe Manchin and maybe one or two others, it was Republicans who had voted against the extension. And Ron's point was that, in fact, Democrats did a good job providing goods and services and passing legislation, but he said they provided it for the wrong thing, right? Like politically speaking, right? Like the bridge that's going to be built in 10 years' time doesn't get you as far as the help with childcare or with nursing or something like that. And so, is that where you come down?
Yeah, I don't know, right? Because I think part of the problem too is that there's there's like a popularism argument about like if we just did popular stuff.
Just do popular shit.
Yeah. I would add to that.
And then there's that's like deliverism too, right? If you can just deliver the goods, like people were rewarded for it.
But why do we lose Teamsters, right? Like, we've had
that's the problem. You rescue their pension and then they don't support you, that was the main thing.
Because politics is downstream from culture, right? And people will take a benefit. They may be pleased with the benefit. But in the end, this stuff is getting extremely tribal. And we are the hardest thing to grapple with is this idea that even if we pass the farm bill with all the important things for rural communities and rural broadband, right? Like you can infrastructure rural broadband sort of saving or at least extending the life of the United States Postal Service,
Right.
right? And the CTC, you could argue like that is like a package that you should be able to sell in rural America.
And yet,
if I showed up in certain communities in rural America, I would just look like a pointy-shoed dude who they were not interested in hearing what I was selling. And so,
right.
like that's hard because there's not an easy answer for that. But part of it is, to your point, like we think about the information environment problem as a question of I have a message and why isn't it getting through to them?
Right.
It's also an information environment in both directions, right? It's a question of why are we not hearing what's actually going on with them and what are their actual pain points? Not what policy could we make that gives me a bullet point, but rather why are they so pissed off at urban people?
Right. Well, Bernie sort of famously went out to West Virginia, rural West Virginia, to try to sell, Medicare for all. And the crowds loved it, right? Like, I don't know if that proves anything, but I think going there is obviously part of the issue. I guess the other thing, though, when you talk about the stuff and culture being downstream and just communicators, like, what's your honest take on gender and race here, right? I mean, we've had two cases where female candidates have run against Trump, not done well. And then we've had the stately old white guy run against Trump and win. I mean, I know that's simplistic, but I just haven't really heard like what I feel like is an honest assessment about whether to what degree gender and race played a role in this past election.
I don't mean to dodge this, but I do think this is a serious enough question and it's a weighty enough question that that's one where I would want to look hard at data. Yeah. Because it's also true that when Biden was our likely nominee, we were doing extremely poorly with African American
of course.
voters and Latino voters. And so I think New Mexico would have been in play. I think
with Biden,
I think, Washington State was never really going to be in play, but might have made us more nervous. I just think the whole thing would have been like, it would have been an actual catastrophe. Right. And so hard to know, what motivates individual voters. So, but I mean, I would go with, I don't want to say it was worth 2% because that could be, pulled by an aggregator. Sure. But I do think it's sort of like it is that principle where everything's worth something, right? Everything is, and you could and this is the problem with the punditry around the election is it's so damn close, right? That you could say it was defund the police, or you could say it was like we didn't, Kamala didn't.
She should have gone on Rogan.
She should have gone on Rogan. Like everything's worth that amount of votes. Right. And so it allows everybody to be right, but also full of shit.
Yeah. Sure. Fair enough. Well, you opened up the Pandora's box. So I got to ask you, Biden, I mean, what is your assessment of the legacy now?
I think we accomplished a lot legislatively. But history is not always totally fair. And historians are going to be a little less interested in stuff that sounds like, good, solid legislative achievements, but bookended by Donald Trump. And and so I think his foundational error was not deciding, after a successful midterms to just say, I was always meaning to be a transitional figure, and I'm going to follow through with that. And he could endorse his vice president, which would have been appropriate. Mm-hmm.
Arguably, it was the successful midterms probably that convinced him to give it a run, right?
I think that's right, and I think it was staff. I do think there were people in his world who, and this is a natural phenomenon, who said, "Shit, we're succeeding. Let's run it back." Right. And after a successful midterms, and then even, by the way, it was just still this year, right? Like a pretty kick-ass State of the Union, and then off to Ukraine, 12-hour train ride. Like, I don't think the question for most voters is chronological age, it's vigor. Right. And like he showed it. And so I I had met with him in August of 23, and we had a foreign policy conversation in the Oval. And I remember coming home and saying, like, dude still got it, right? But then I hadn't seen him physically, in quite a while. And I just think it's hard. People, a former chief of staff always says to me, power is never given, it is only taken.
Right.
And so you're in charge of everything and you're having a run of success. It is very hard not to run it back. But I think objectively speaking, the earlier he would have announced his departure, the better situated Kamala would have been.
Yeah, I do remember in that crazy 3 weeks after the debate talking to a very senior Democrat who was convinced that he would eventually step down, but said to me something like, point to me like a period in history where someone willingly gave up power. It just doesn't happen, right? Like it just doesn't happen. So, but they were like preaching patience, but at some point the clock just kind of ran out. I only have a little bit more time, but I want to look forward a little bit. So we've outlined all the things that you think Democrats could do better and things that could do differently. But now sort of the real existential question is, what do you do about Trump and what is about to happen? And look, if we just take him at his words, mass deportations right away, we're going to see a push to get all those tax cuts extended. We're going to see, potentially efforts to arrest members of Congress. We just don't know how serious to take that, but let's take it seriously. And then you have a lot of revamping of federal government, and not by revamping probably understates it, right? It's like massive revamping and or destruction of federal government. So what does one do in that position when you have one of 100 important votes?
Well, I think, I don't mean to be coy, and I think this is different from not being prepared.
Right.
But I actually think that this is more like, whatever your analogy, poker game, chess match. You simply can't script your plan out
right
until you see what the opposition does. And one thing that I think I know is that we cannot be the party of, can you believe he did that?
Right.
Which is different from saying that we won't oppose and fight and mobilize and do everything we can to protect people and institutions. But I think we're going to have to demonstrate to the public, which is paying less attention than the resistance, that we are not immediately wishing for his failure, right? And if he decides to wake up on January 20th and say, I vanquished my political enemies, I'm pardoning myself, fuck it, I'm going to be popular, right? And then I think we have to contend with that and the political difficulties that it would present, right? If he suddenly sounded reasonable. But to me, that would be a very good trade-off for American-style democracy to, stay standing.
Sure.
And so I just think we need to calibrate our mobilization and our outrage based on what he does, not based on what he says he's going to do.
All right, so let's go down this. I don't want to. I know you never engage in hypotheticals, but like, let's say, what I hear you saying is, let's say, day 1, 2, 3, the deportation force really is just focusing on criminals, people who clearly are illegally, maybe causing some trouble, have some records, but it's leaving the sort of service workers alone and the farmers alone and all that stuff. And Democrats at that point, I think, as I understand, you don't need to and shouldn't go crazy. They should speak about it as, this should be a starting point for more comprehensive immigration reform. Like, how would you, is that what you're saying, sort of?
I mean, look, I don't know what he's planning to do.
Sure.
But I think let me just say on immigration, one of the things that I've learned from Ruben Gallego and Michael Bennett and others is that there's a real appetite among reasonable people who don't wake up every morning like frothing at the mouth about race politics. There's a real appetite for security at the border. There is even among left-wing people, there's a sense of, I don't like disorder and I don't like line cutting. And so one of the things that I have learned is deporting bad guys is very popular, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And if you can express a willingness to say, if there are bad guys in this country, they should be removed from this country. What happens then is the voter, the citizen's mind opens and says, oh, this person's kind of reasonable. And then you can make the argument for legal immigration, for being kind to DACA recipients, for the inflationary impact that it would have, for the, by the way, the insane amount of government expansion that would be required to round up 13 million people. If you start there, people don't think you believe in sort of the basic rule of law and the idea that people don't get to just come here without some sort of procedure and process. And so I just think we need to understand that Ruben Gallego and John Hickenlooper and Ben Ray Lujan and Martin Heinrich and Mark Kelly have and by the way, Barack Obama have a progressive view about immigration and border security that is not inconsistent with our values, but does not make us sound like we don't give two shits if there are thousands of people stacking up at the border. And by the way, one of the things that convinced me to support the Murphy-Langford legislation was, if you looked at those pictures, by the way, on the border, there's nothing humane about the situation there. Right. It was properly, it wasn't just disorderly in the sense that I think, this is making people unsafe, but like they were really shitty conditions. I've been to refugee camps in Jordan that were, safer and more humane. And so I just think we need to recognize where the public is, and we can do so without abandoning our core principles.
Just somewhat similar, but more domestic oriented, because the other sort of debate among Democrats right now on the Hill is like, how much do you participate in DOGE, right? Like, so immigration is its own bag, but here you have this quasi-governmental entity. I don't actually think they're governmental. I probably end up being a nonprofit of some sort. But it's unclear how much power they have, and yet they could potentially make a series of sweeping recommendations that would affect millions of people's lives, working lives. I'm talking about bureaucrats, and then, of course, government agencies writ large. We've seen some Democrats say, yeah, I'll work with them and I'll talk about waste at the Pentagon and things like that. And other Democrats say this is ridiculous and they actually are feckless, and why are we giving them any, time of day?
Yeah, I think, first of all, there's an appetite for having government function properly. And again, even as we talk about whether or not to engage in DOGE, we need to start there and say there is a broad-based frustration with government at the state, county, federal level. And again, we don't want to be Soviet in our defense of bureaucracy and in our defense of things that aren't working, especially, by the way, when our party is not in charge of the bureaucracy at the current time, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I think the Republicans are excellent at is, if anything's going wrong, it's the Democrats' fault, right? And I think we have to get into a habit of not being unfair about it, but if there is an executive branch execution problem, if there's a customer service problem, that is not our problem. That is the Republicans who are in charge of the government's problem. So all of that having been said, DOGE, I don't know, maybe, but it does seem like an advisory function. And where the rubber hits the road is going to be, okay, where do you want to find the savings? And I will point out, without just trying to crap all over this before it even starts, that if you want $2 trillion in savings, you are cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Yeah.
And
you don't think they can find that in waste and IT?
No.
Procurement reform?
Waste, fraud, and abuse. It's just not, it's not doable.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of even Republicans who are on the Appropriations Committee are trying not to piss off these people, but they're sort of okay, look forward to what you come up with.
Right. All right. Last question. Well, maybe the last question. We'll see how you answer it. This interview is taking place in the aftermath of a couple of notable things that basically people who are worried about Trump categorize as preemptive capitulation. Okay. Chris Wray, the FBI director, saying he would resign, paving the way for Kash Patel potentially to just get confirmed. A number of newspaper tycoons or executives or media moguls going down to Mar-a-Lago or donating to the inauguration. ABC News settling a $15 million defamation suit with Trump. I know the sort of underlying theme of this interview has been don't put your hair on fire over everything, and don't get into a defensive crouch defending institutions. But in this case, a lot of people are freaked out by what they see as powerful people bending the knee. And I'm wondering if you see it that way.
I mean, I do. I think the challenge that I have as it relates to all of this is, everybody understands now this concept of obeying in advance.
Right.
But there's also like a kind of leftist, we're cooked, what's it all for? This guy's already all powerful. Yeah. The Supreme Court has given him immunity. We already have a king. And I think that is a chicken shit way to operate. I saw Leah Lippman last night talking about no, the plain letter of the law is that you can't, I forgot if it was birthright citizenship or something else.
Sure.
But it was look, the law still means something. Some of these CEOs and publishers are acting like CEOs and publishers.
Right.
But it's not like the Fourth Estate just said, well, fuck it. I'm going to just be state-owned media. You're not doing that. I don't even think ABC News or Washington Post or LA Times reporters are doing that. And so is it alarming? For sure. Is it the end? Absolutely not. And I just worry very much that people who are very critical about obeying in advance are also catastrophizing to the point where people start to feel powerless. We're not fucking powerless here, right? It is still of, by, and for the people. We still have 3 branches of government. We still have some semblance of checks and balances. Are they going to be strained like maybe never before? Yes. But, the thing that makes me most furious on the internet, I'm not exactly sure why, is people quote tweeting someone that they're frustrated with and saying, we're cooked. And I'm like, well, fuck.
Well, what if it's not? Well, hold on. What if it's not a feeling of powerlessness, but more a feeling of exhaustion? Like, it's been 8 years, and when I talk to Democrats, honestly, that's it. Like, they are usually exhausted. They're like, I just don't know. Like, I did X, Y, and Z. We made this argument. We thought it was compelling. Didn't work. Like, that's more the pervasive feeling from my conversations.
Well, and that's why, I actually think one of the, people went online and said, what should we be doing? And I said, get some rest, right?
Right.
Because I actually do think, I manage people. I used to, by the way, manage volunteers for a living. That was my job. And you can kind of tell when the team needs a little bit of, replenishment. And,
sure.
to use a sort of wartime analogy, you can look at your troops and you can say I guess I could characterize it as courage if I sent all these people right back into the battlefield, but I think they're thirsty and I think they like to see their spouses and I think they need a week. Right. And so I do think part of what's happening with the resistance is people need to collect themselves and get ready for the coming battle. Not that we're preemptively giving up, but also that the only people paying super close attention are resistance types right now. And the old adage, you can't sell snow tires in June, which is not something I knew growing up in Hawaii.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. Is when it's time to make the argument, when people are focused on, say, the Trump tax bill or the tariffs or some crazy unlawful shit he's doing, that is the time to engage. But right now, just going, he's likely to do some bad shit, sounds a lot like what we've been saying for the last 8 years. And so I think we just need, the events are going to, ride us. And we're going to have to respond vigorously and strategically. But I think we're lying to people if we think that we can be at an 11 from now until January 20th and maintain our momentum.
Yeah. All right. We'll know when this time is for the snow tires. Senator Schatz, thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. It was a good conversation. A lot of time to give to us. So I do genuinely appreciate that. And, I know that your father probably was disappointed that you were not a doctor, but I think being a senator is not so
correct.
Bad. Yeah. Okay. All right. And thank you all for tuning in to the Bulwark. As always, subscribe to the channel. We will see you soon.